Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. You've probably heard those chilling words before. They were recalled by J. Robert Oppenheimer back in 1945, right after he watched the very first atomic bomb detonate in the New Mexico desert. And honestly, it's hard to overstate the magnitude of that moment. With one blinding flash of light, the United States didn't just put an end to a global conflict. It literally crossed the threshold into the atomic age and forever altered its place in the world.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're tracking one of the most dramatic, whiplash-inducing transformations in human history. We're looking at how, in just over a decade, the United States evolved from a stagnant, economically bruised nation that was desperately trying to ignore the outside world into a nuclear-armed global superpower. We're going to break down exactly how the absolute crucible of the Second World War acted as the ultimate catalyst for this massive shift.
Okay, let's dive right into our roadmap for this explainer. First up, the reluctant giant. Then, Pearl Harbor and entry. We'll look at the home front arsenal, step into the global crucible, examine the destroyer of worlds, and finally, wrap up with the dawn of the Cold War.
Chapter 1. The Reluctant Giant. Picture America in the 1930s. The nation is deeply scarred by the Great Depression, and the horrific, bloody memories of the First World War are still super fresh. For most Americans, the absolute priority was just avoiding another European conflict at all costs. It was all about America First isolationism. But while Americans were trying to retreat into their shell, dictators across the globe were aggressively expanding. I mean, look at the timeline. In 1931, Japan occupies Manchuria. In 1933, Adolf Hitler takes power as German chancellor. And how does the US respond? In 1935, they passed the Neutrality Acts, which essentially tied their own hands behind their backs. But, as we know, you can't really ignore a global epidemic of lawlessness forever. By 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union shocked everyone by jointly invading Poland, and that officially sparked the Second World War.
The public mood back then was incredibly intense, and there's a quote by Ernest Hemingway from 1935 that absolutely hits the nail on the head. He wrote, "We were fools to be sucked in once on a European war, and we should never be sucked in again." That right there, that was the overwhelming peace-at-any-price psychology that President Franklin D. Roosevelt was trying to navigate, even while he was privately terrified that isolationism wasn't going to protect anyone from fascism.
Which brings us to Chapter 2, Pearl Harbor and entry.
So FDR is doing his best to make the US the arsenal of democracy by quietly lending supplies to Great Britain. But ultimately, this reluctant giant was dragged onto the world stage by a violent, sudden shock. As Japan kept aggressively expanding into China and French Indochina, the Roosevelt administration decided to turn the screws, applying heavy economic pressure. This culminated in freezing Japanese assets and slapping them with a total oil embargo. In response, Japan took a massive gamble, a surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The very next day, Congress declared war, and just like that, isolationism was extinguished overnight.
Now, you might be wondering, why would Japan take such a crazy risk? Well, it all comes down to 80%. Japan was importing a staggering 80% of its fuel from the United States. So that American asset freeze and oil embargo, it functioned like an economic noose. It backed the Japanese high command into a corner where they had to choose between making crippling concessions to abandon their empire or going to all-out war. They chose war, committing what pretty much every historian agrees was a catastrophic strategic blunder by waking up an industrial giant.
Moving on to Chapter 3, the home front arsenal.
What's literally mind-blowing here is how entering this conflict completely restructured the American economy from the ground up. The U.S. essentially suspended the free market. To foot the bill for the war, the government leaned hard into massive Keynesian deficit spending. We're talking about the federal debt rocketing from $43 billion to almost $259 billion. And the income tax? That morphed into a mass tax. The number of tax-paying citizens exploded from about 4 million to over 42 million. Plus, with 16 million men shipped off to the military, the iconic Rosie the Riveter movement kicked into high gear, pushing the female labor force up to 37%. This entire machine was so efficient that by the war's end, the U.S. was supplying half of everything produced on the entire planet.
But we have to be real here. This unprecedented mobilization brought some deeply ugly contradictions to the surface. FDR was out there telling the world that America was fighting for the 4 freedoms to defend democracy abroad. Yet back at home, fueled by pure war hysteria and racism, the U.S. forced roughly 110,000 Japanese Americans into internment camps. Out in Los Angeles, you had the Zoot Suit riots, where white servicemen were actively attacking Mexican-American youths in the streets. And ironically, the very military that was fighting to liberate Europe from fascism was still rigidly and officially segregated by race.
Despite having every reason to be cynical about America's hypocritical racial practices, minority groups overwhelmingly stepped up to contribute to the war effort. Heavyweight boxing champ Joe Louis captured this vibe perfectly. He said, "There may be a whole lot wrong with America, but there's nothing that Hitler can fix." That exact spirit is what fueled the WWII campaign championed by the black press. It was this powerful rallying cry for African Americans to fight for two victories: defeating fascism abroad and defeating racism right at home.
Chapter 4: The Global Crucible.
To really grasp this era, it's absolutely crucial to understand the grim, unprecedented scale of a true two-front global war. The sheer geographical spread of this conflict is almost incomprehensible. Over in the Pacific, after the Allies were defeated in the Philippines, thousands of soldiers perished in the brutal 65-mile Bataan Death March. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the Soviet Red Army finally managed to halt the Nazi advance at Stalingrad, but it cost them at least 750,000 casualties in that one battle alone. In the West, we saw D-Day, an invasion force of over 3 million Allied soldiers storming the beaches of Normandy. And up in the air, the U.S. launched devastating firebombing campaigns over Japan, deliberately targeting cities to crush civilian morale.
But we have to pause and talk about the darkest reality of this war, which is represented by one chilling number: 6 million. That is the approximate number of European Jews who were systematically murdered by the Nazi regime during the Holocaust. Driven by a sickening, genocidal racial ideology, the Nazis used mobile killing squads and horrific death factories like Auschwitz to wipe out 2/3 of Europe's Jewish population, alongside millions of Soviet POWs, Roma people, and other targeted minority groups. When Allied forces finally broke through and pushed into Germany, they stumbled upon these death camps firsthand. General Dwight D. Eisenhower actually went to visit the Ohrdruf camp shortly after it was liberated. He wrote back to Washington saying, "The visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were so overpowering as to leave me a bit sick." He went there deliberately to witness it with his own eyes, to gather the hard evidence so that no one in the future could ever try to brush the Holocaust off as just wartime propaganda. Finding those camps cemented, without a shadow of a doubt, the absolute moral necessity of the Allied victory.
Chapter 5: The Destroyer of Worlds.
So as the war in Europe is finally drawing to a close, a massive curveball hits Washington. On April 12, 1945, President Roosevelt suddenly passes away. Vice President Harry Truman, a guy who had only been vice president for 82 days, suddenly inherits the presidency. Get this, Truman didn't even know the atomic bomb existed. Literally minutes after taking the oath of office, an entirely uninformed Truman gets briefed on the top-secret Manhattan Project. He was immediately thrust into making arguably the heaviest, most consequential military decision in human history. Truman had to weigh the projected massive American casualties of a full-scale mainland invasion of Japan against the horrifying destruction of this new bomb. Now, the scale of civilian death was already off the charts. Just look at the conventional Tokyo firebombing orchestrated by General LeMay that killed over 83,000 people in a single night. But the atomic bombs that were ultimately dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, that brought an entirely new, terrifying level of instantaneous, vaporizing devastation. It killed approximately 250,000 people combined, and the sheer shock of that unprecedented destruction is what finally forced Japan's unconditional surrender.
Finally, Chapter 6: Dawn of the Cold War. You'd think the end of the worst war in history meant everyone could finally relax, right? Not even close. The ashes of World War II gave birth almost immediately to the intense paranoia of a brand new global standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union, and the shift in American leadership was a huge factor here. FDR genuinely believed he could manage Joseph Stalin using gentlemanly diplomacy, like he did at Yalta, to get Soviet help against Japan in exchange for free elections in Eastern Europe. Truman, though? Truman wasn't buying it. Armed with America's brand new atomic monopoly, he leaned into blunt, aggressive diplomacy, even castigating the Soviet foreign minister for broken promises just days after taking office.
So, the wartime alliance essentially evaporated overnight. The post-war map just turned into a new battleground. Germany, and specifically Berlin, were sliced up into these super tense occupation zones. On the Polish question, Stalin just flat out ignored his promises from Yalta and installed a pro-Soviet puppet regime to create a buffer against the West. And then there was the atomic paranoia. Truman casually brought up the bomb to intimidate Stalin, but Soviet spies had already clued him in. which just accelerated Stalin's own frantic nuclear program. As Winston Churchill famously declared not long after, an Iron Curtain had officially descended right across Europe.
So here's what I want to leave you with today, and it's a bit of a provocative thought. Did the weapons that won the war guarantee that the world would never truly know peace again? Think about it. The Second World War yanked America out of its isolationist shell and built up this unmatched military-industrial machine. But by the time the dust finally settled, that reluctant giant had transformed into a permanent, heavily armed nuclear superpower. They were now locked into a bitter ideological struggle that would eventually spawn the containment policies of the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, and even push humanity to the absolute brink of annihilation during the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's wild to think about. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history that continues to shape our world today.